A man walks into a room in Paris. He sits down in front of a committee of French senators. He represents one of the most powerful technology companies on Earth, and he is under oath. The question they ask him is simple. Can you guarantee, under oath, right now, that the data of French citizens stored on Microsoft servers will never be handed to the United States government without France's permission? He pauses. Then he says 5 words that will change the course of European technology policy. No, I cannot guarantee that. That moment, June 2025, set off a chain of events that is still unfolding right now. And if you think this is just a story about Europe, stay with me. Because what is happening on that continent this month has direct implications for every person watching this video who has ever wondered whether the companies they depend on actually work for them. We are going to show you exactly what was voted on, exactly what was announced, and this is the part nobody is talking about loudly enough. The one fact buried inside all of this that should stop you cold. Here is the number that changes everything. 2.5 million. That is the number of French government workers, civil servants, ministry employees, public administrators, whose computers France has now officially ordered to be wiped of Microsoft Windows and replaced with Linux. Every single one, every ministry, every department, every affiliated public body. The directive came down on April 8, 2026, from France's Interministerial Digital Directorate, known as DINUM, and it did not use polite language. France's Minister of Public Action and Accounts, David Amiel, said this: "We must regain control of our digital destiny. We can no longer accept a situation in which we lack control over our data and infrastructure, while remaining dependent on decisions made by foreign companies." That is a cabinet minister of a G7 nation explicitly naming the United States as a foreign dependency his country intends to break. To understand the scale, consider this. The German state of Schleswig-Holstein, previously held up as Europe's leading example of a government moving to Linux, migrated 30,000 computers. France's number is 80 times larger. And France did not stop at the desktop. The directive covers the entire technology stack: collaboration tools, cloud infrastructure, antivirus software, artificial intelligence platforms, databases, network equipment, everything. But the French announcement was not the only thing that happened this month. On June 3, 2026, the European Commission proposed the Cloud and AI Development Act, a piece of legislation specifically designed to bar Amazon, Microsoft, and Google from the most sensitive government contracts across all 27 EU member states. And on June 4th, the European Parliament replaced Google as the default search engine on all of its internal computers. 3 separate actions, 12 days apart. That is not coincidence. That is coordination. And the reason it started this month traces back to one room, one man, and those 4 words spoken under oath. We will get to that in a moment. To understand how Europe arrived here, you need to understand 2 things that were happening simultaneously. One is a legal problem that nobody wanted to say out loud. The other is a pricing problem that nobody could ignore. Start with the legal problem. The United States passed a law in 2018 called the Cloud Act, the Clarifying Lawful Overseas Use of Data Act. What it does is straightforward. It gives American authorities the power to demand data from American technology companies, regardless of where that data is physically stored. Even if the servers are in Frankfurt, even if the data belongs to a French hospital or a German defense ministry. If a US court issues the order, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon must comply. They are American companies. They have no choice. For years, European governments told themselves this was a theoretical risk. The Americans would not actually do it. There were transparency reports. There were contractual guarantees. There were assurances. The data was encrypted. The servers were in Europe. Then came June 2025 and that hearing in the French Senate. Anton Carniot is the Director of Public and Legal Affairs at Microsoft France. He is a lawyer. He knows precisely what words mean. And when the committee asked him directly, under oath, whether he could guarantee that French citizen data would never leave European servers without French government consent, he said no. He added that such a request had never happened. But the question was not whether it had happened. The question was whether it could happen. It could. Senator Simon Uzenat, who chaired the committee, noted that Microsoft's own transparency reports, the documents the company publishes to show governments they are not handing over data, are, in his words, purely declarative with no external oversight. There it is an independent auditor, no third party checking the claim, just Microsoft's word. Now add the pricing problem. Microsoft raised Dynamics 365 prices by 10% in 2024. Azure costs increased. Windows 10 reached end of support in late 2025, which meant governments across Europe faced a choice: pay Microsoft for extended security updates or upgrade to hardware that could run Windows 11. The UK's Competition and Markets Authority formally found that Microsoft's cloud licensing terms make it more expensive to run Microsoft software on competing cloud platforms, effectively steering customers toward Azure. The European Commission opened formal investigations. Amazon and Google filed complaints alleging anti-competitive behavior. German MEP Alexandra Geese, one of the architects of the EU's Digital Services Act, put it directly: Europe risks being blackmailed by both American and Chinese tech giants. That phrase, blackmailed, is not the language of routine trade disputes. It is the language of governments who believe they have lost control of something essential. And the question of what they plan to do about it is where this story gets interesting. Because the answer did not start with a vote in Brussels. It started with a police force in France, 17 years ago. Long before any of the announcements this month, one French institution had already proved the concept quietly and without fanfare. The Gendarmerie Nationale, France's national military police force, began migrating to Linux in 2008. By 2026, they had been running over 100,000 computers on Linux for more than 17 years. No crashes, no catastrophic failures, no headlines about the project collapsing, just 100,000 workstations quietly doing what government workstations are supposed to do. That is the proof of concept that David Amiel's April directive is built on. France is not guessing. France has a working model inside its own borders that has been running for nearly 2 decades. The turning point, the moment when the quiet became loud, was that Senate hearing in June 2025. Because Carnot's testimony did something that years of policy papers and academic arguments had failed to do. It gave European politicians a concrete, on-the-record, sworn moment they could point to. This is what changed. Before June 2025, the argument for digital sovereignty was ideological. After June 2025, it was legal. Microsoft's own lawyer had confirmed under oath that the Cloud Act creates a structural vulnerability that no contractual guarantee can close. If a legally valid US government request arrives, Microsoft must comply. Full stop. The French Senate inquiry had also uncovered something else. French government contracts were still, at that time, flowing to American cloud providers despite the availability of European alternatives like OVH and Scaleway. There was a gap between what French policy said and what French procurement actually did. The directive of April 2026 was designed to close that gap permanently, and then Brussels moved. On June 3, 2026, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced the Cloud and AI Development Act, alongside a broader tech sovereignty package that includes a revised CHIPS Act and an EU open source strategy. Von der Leyen's framing was precise. We cannot afford to depend on others for the technologies that keep our hospitals running, our energy grids stable, and our services secure. The Commission's own figures tell the story. The EU relies on non-European countries for more than 80% of its key digital products, services, and infrastructure. American cloud providers, primarily AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud, control more than 70% of the EU cloud market. European providers hold roughly 15%. The legislation introduces 4 tiers of cloud sovereignty, ranked by how much of a provider's operations remain inside EU jurisdiction. The critical detail is this: American companies are structurally unable to reach the top tier, not because of anything they have done wrong, but because the Cloud Act exists. Executive Vice President Hinna Virkkunen explained it plainly. The Cloud Act creates a barrier that American firms cannot pass regardless of where they put their servers. And, a day later, on June 4th, the European Parliament replaced Google Search with Quant, a French alternative, on all of its internal computers. The message was deliberate. The escalation is real, and it has only just begun. What is unfolding now is not a single country experiment. It is a cascade. Start with the country that moved first. In April 2024, the German state of Schleswig-Holstein announced it was ditching Microsoft entirely. Teams, Word, Excel, Outlook across its state government offices, replacing everything with LibreOffice, Linux, and OpenExchange. By the end of 2025, the state had completed 80% of that migration, 30,000 workstations. The expectation is to save tens of millions of euros in licensing costs. Then, Denmark. The Danish government began planning a shift away from foreign tech dependency, with Digital Minister Caroline Stage Olsen explaining, "We must never make ourselves so dependent on so few that we can no longer act freely." Too much public digital infrastructure is currently tied up with very few foreign suppliers. This makes us vulnerable. Cities including Copenhagen and Aarhus followed. Then France's January 2026 mandate, banning Microsoft Teams and Zoom for 2.5 million civil servants and replacing them with Visio, a government-developed platform built on open-source Jitsi, hosted on certified European servers built by Outscale, a subsidiary of the French company Dassault Systems. Then France's April 2026 directive. Then Brussels in June. Meanwhile, a cross-party letter signed by 38 members of the European Parliament in 2025 formally urged a phase out of Microsoft and other foreign tools across all EU institutions, citing strategic vulnerabilities. Worldwide spending on sovereign cloud infrastructure is forecast to reach $80 billion in 2026. European spending in this category is growing at 83% year over year. The European Commission estimates that roughly 120 billion euros in combined public and private investment in cloud and AI infrastructure will be needed by 2035 to make European capacity genuinely competitive. That is not a policy aspiration. That is a construction project, and it connects directly back to the Trump administration. When Trump returned to the presidency in January 2025, European governments accelerated their timelines. The concern was not abstract. The ICC prosecutor, whose court is based in The Hague and whose work is central to European ideas of international law, lost access to his Microsoft account following a US executive order. Microsoft itself was not blamed for what happened, but the episode crystallized the risk European governments had been discussing in committee rooms for years. When a US administration decides it wants to exert pressure, American cloud infrastructure is a lever it can pull. Europe has decided it is no longer willing to leave that lever within reach. But before we get to what all of this means in practice, and who actually wins and loses here, there is a human story that brings this off the policy pages and into something you can feel. And it starts not in a government building, but with the kind of organization you might not have expected to find at the center of a data sovereignty dispute. Imagine you are a doctor in a French hospital. Your patient's records, scans, prescriptions, history sit in a database that runs on Microsoft Azure. That database is hosted on servers in France. You are told the data never leaves the country. Then a lawyer sits under oath in the French Senate and tells elected officials that he cannot guarantee that the US government cannot access that data. This is not hypothetical. The Senate inquiry in June 2025 specifically examined the Health Data Hub, France's national health data platform, which uses Microsoft Azure to host sensitive health data for tens of millions of French patients. The admission by Anton Carniot was not made in the abstract. It was made in a hearing that included this specific platform, this specific data, and the specific question of whether it was genuinely protected. That is the real human weight behind the policy language. 2.5 million civil servants is a number. But when you ask who those people are, health workers, border officers, military administrators, criminal justice staff, the data sovereignty question stops being academic and starts being urgent. The gendarmerie's experience matters here too. Those 100,000 officers using Linux for 17 years did not simply tolerate the change. The migration, which began before smartphone apps existed as a category, forced the organization to invest in building its own internal support capacity. They trained their own people. They built workflows around open tools. And the result, 17 years later, is an organization that owns its own technology stack, pays no licensing fees to a foreign corporation, and is not subject to any external decision about when a product reaches end of life. When Windows 10 went out of support in late 2025, the gendarmerie's computers kept running exactly as they had the day before. Nobody sent them an invoice. Nobody told them to upgrade their hardware. Nobody from Redmond, Washington had any say in the matter. For the civil servant in Paris switching on her computer on January 1st, 2027, this transition will feel disruptive. Learning a new system is always disruptive. But the gendarmerie spent 17 years proving that the disruption is finite and the independence is permanent. There is also a financial dimension that lands personally. Schleswig-Holstein expects to save tens of millions of euros from its migration. France, with a government computing estate 80 times larger, is looking at savings that dwarf that figure. The Commission's estimate that the EU cloud market is 70% controlled by 3 American companies means that a meaningful portion of European public spending on technology flows directly to the United States every year. For the ordinary taxpayer in Lyon or Liverpool, that is money collected in taxes being spent on perpetual licensing fees to companies incorporated in Washington State and California, companies that operate under laws that may not serve European interests. That is not an accusation, it is an accounting fact, and the policy response now underway is, at its core, Europe's decision to treat that accounting fact as a strategic problem worth solving. Here is what is real and what is complicated. The optimistic case for what Europe is doing is straightforward. Digital sovereignty is a legitimate policy goal. No serious government should be in a position where a foreign country can legally compel access to its citizens' data or its critical infrastructure. The Cloud Act is a real law with real implications. The EU spending 80% of its digital budget with non-European providers is a structural vulnerability. The gendarmerie has already proved that Linux migration works at scale over the long term. The financial savings are real. The policy rationale is sound. The pessimistic case is also real. Moving 2.5 million workstations off Windows is an enormous operational challenge. Experts are already flagging 3 specific risks. First, legacy applications. Many government systems run software that was written for Windows and has never been tested on Linux. Migrating the desktop is one thing. Migrating the entire stack of applications sitting on top of it is a different problem entirely. Second, retraining. Hundreds of thousands of civil servants who have used Windows for their entire careers will need support, time, and patience. Productivity will drop during the changeover. That cost is real. Third, European cloud capacity is genuinely limited. The European Commission acknowledges that American providers control 70% of the market. Building competitive European alternatives will require that €120 billion investment, and it will take years. There is also a commercial reality that the policy documents do not fully address. Microsoft and Google are not standing still. Microsoft has launched sovereign cloud offerings in Europe. Google formed a joint venture with the French company Thales, called S3NS, specifically to offer EU-controlled cloud services, and this joint venture was among the 4 companies selected to supply cloud services to EU institutions. These companies are adapting. They are not simply being expelled. They are competing for a different category of contract. The Cloud and AI Development Act is also not yet law. It was proposed on June 3, 2026. The legislative process in the EU takes time. The target for final adoption is late 2027. Between now and then, there will be lobbying, amendment, and political negotiation. American companies and the US government will not accept this quietly. From Washington's perspective, what the EU is doing looks like industrial protectionism dressed in sovereignty language. Both things can be true simultaneously. A policy can be protectionist and necessary at the same time. The honest question is whether Europe can execute. The policy ambition is clear. The political will is, for the moment, present. The technical and financial challenge is enormous. The timeline is optimistic. And the history of large-scale government IT projects in Europe and everywhere else is not encouraging. What is different this time is that the political class is not pushing toward a single proprietary solution. They are pushing toward open-source standards. Linux, LibreOffice, Jitsi. These are not European products controlled by a European monopoly. They are open-source tools that no single entity owns. That is a meaningfully different risk profile from simply replacing Microsoft with a European Microsoft. Whether that distinction is enough to make this work at the scale France is attempting, that is the question the next 5 years will answer. Go back to that room in Paris. June 2025. Anton Carniot, under oath. 4 words? No, I cannot guarantee that. In the 12 months that followed, France ordered 2.5 million computers off Windows. The European Parliament dropped Google as its search engine. The European Commission proposed a law that structurally bars American cloud providers from the most sensitive government contracts across 27 countries. And the political language shifted from "we are exploring alternatives" to "we must break free." One moment of honest testimony accelerated an entire continent's technology policy. That is not a small story. That is a story that will shape what government computing looks like for the next generation, and it will create winners and losers inside and outside Europe in ways we are only beginning to understand. The next video in this series is going to take you inside the specific Linux distributions that European governments are now choosing, and why the Gendarmerie's internal distribution, which they have been running for 17 years, has become the quiet blueprint for what France is about to do at a scale no one has attempted before. If you have ever used Windows and wondered whether Linux is actually ready for serious work, that video is built for you. It is specific. It is based on what real government IT teams are actually deploying right now. Not theory. Practice. If this video showed you something you did not know before, subscribe. Not because there is more content coming, but because this story is not finished. Europe is in the middle of it right now, and so is everyone who uses a computer that runs on American software. We will be right here when the next chapter breaks.